Chapter 20. Jesus carrying his own cross. Pilate flogged him. That Jesus bore the cross was God's will, and it was to fulfill the Bible. For this work, God sent Jesus to this earth. God sent, Judas sold, and the Jewish people bound. That Jesus underwent Pilate's flogging in John 19:1 was because inside Jesus there was the heart of God that loved humankind. Jesus brought with himself to this earth the love of God that saves humankind. That is why, to save humankind, Jesus was flogged. Pilate could not find crime in Jesus, as revealed in John 19:4, and tried not to put his hands on him. But the reason Pilate flogged him was that such work was also inside of God's plan. Sometimes, even though there is work that one does not want to do, if it's God's plan, the flesh and blood human has no choice and ends up doing it. Twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. It says in Isaiah 53:5, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we were healed." The soldiers of the Jewish people weaved a crown out of thorns and put it on Jesus' head. Words prophesied through prophets in the Hebrew scriptures were fulfilled just as they were. If it were not for God's plan, the soldiers could not weave a crown of thorns, place it on the head of Jesus, and put a purple robe on him. They were used in all such work for God's plan. They made a crown out of thorns and stabbed him. How painful this must have been for him. The crown of thorns was pushed down on the head of Jesus, and blood came flowing down. Starting from the head, Jesus' blood and water that spills love toward humankind flow. This is God's agape love. From inside Jesus, God's forgiveness and love flowed out. Living water that saves humankind came out of Jesus and flows to the inside of us. When that love flows, God's world extends. Since God's love has entered, this love must also come out of us. While God gave out his one and only Son, God forgave and saved us. God saved us while going as far as to kill God's Son. Jesus received the punishment that we were supposed to receive. This love is the love of forgiveness. God said in 1 Corinthians 13:8 that this love would never end. This refers to the love that flowed from the head of Jesus. The head of Jesus is God, and God's love had flowed down from the top. Just as Jesus wore the crown of thorns and poured out all blood and water, when we also pour out my things, God's love flows. Blood that flowed from the head of Jesus is life to me and glory to God. Thus, joy arises in the spirit of the person who received life from God's throne. It was written, King of the Jews. John 19:19 says, Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Jesus is not the King of the world, but the King of heaven. The King of heaven is someone who reigns over the inside of our spirits. Pilate wrote that Jesus was the king because God was taking hold of Pilate's heart. Spiritually, the King of the Jews means victory. Jesus is a person who was victorious. Jesus stood as the King of heaven. Jesus already stood as the King of the Jews, But the Jewish people didn't yet know that Jesus stood as king. This is because they only thought of the king who could be seen. The Jewish people who served God knew the law as the highest and abided by it. The Messiah inside of that law is Jesus. Thus, Jesus is the King of Jews, namely, Jesus is their king. All work moves from inside God's plan. Pilate did it without knowing, but that he wrote Jesus was the King of Jews was something fulfilled from inside God's plan. Even every single word that came out of Pilate's mouth was to fulfill God's plan. God controlled Pilate's heart. Starting from before the creation of the world, having already established the plan of 6,000 years, God does work. From one era to another, God makes such plan appear while fulfilling it through humans. Jesus carrying his own cross. It says in John 19:17, "And carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha." Jesus carries the cross and goes towards Golgotha. His own cross is not the cross of the human, but of Jesus. The cross of the human is the frame of sin, but the cross of Jesus is the frame of salvation that unclothes sin. It is the frame that does away with the cross of the human. The cross of Jesus is the salvation of God towards humankind. Salvation is to bring to life again the person who had died. Even though it seems like the human is alive, when seen with God's eyes, the human is someone who is already dead due to disobedience from Eden. However, due to the cross, God saved me, someone who had died because of sin. All guilt, sin, and lust are buried, and I become born again as God's life. It says in Luke 23:42, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Just as the criminal on the right side of the cross threw his sins before Jesus, I must bury my things inside of the cross. If I give up and throw away the person I at the face of God's cross, God gives back in the things of heaven. Due to the cross of Jesus, I become free from the frame of sin. Then the inside of my spirit enjoys joy and peace. If my frame of sin was unclothed through the love of the cross, I must now go out while being thankful for God's love. Through the cross of Jesus, God has already fulfilled heaven inside us. Yet it's a problem that we still go on carrying the frame of sin. That is why we're not able to enjoy heaven from inside our spirits. Jesus is someone who did away with sin and was victorious, so we must also be victorious. Jesus went the way that sinners go with their crosses, and Jesus changed that way for us into the way of righteousness. Before, that way was the way of the sinner and way of death. But by Jesus carrying his own cross, the way changed into the way of the righteous and way of life. If we also follow the way that Jesus went, we go on the way of righteousness.